December 7, 1941, Tokyo's Ota District, Japan. From his office window, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto watched as the sun illuminated the Imperial Palace grounds. Street celebrations broke out below as word of the Pearl Harbor attack reached the capital. In just over 12 hours, Japanese carrier-based aircraft had struck at Pearl Harbor with surgical precision, causing massive damage and casualties. 8 battleships destroyed or heavily damaged, 400 American lives lost, and more than 350 aircraft obliterated. The operation was a tactical marvel, executed by naval aviators who achieved complete surprise and demonstrated exceptional skill and bravery. However, Yamamoto sat alone in his office, overwhelmed by an ominous sense of dread rather than triumph. While other military leaders and government officials rejoiced over what they perceived as a decisive blow to American naval might, Yamamoto harbored a somber understanding that would haunt him until the end of his life. This attack, which appeared to be Japan's greatest victory, was actually setting in motion its inevitable defeat. During his years spent in America, more than any other senior Japanese military officer of his generation, he had witnessed firsthand the industrial might of the United States. He walked through the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where blast furnaces produced quantities of steel that far surpassed what could be achieved by Japanese factories within a month. In Detroit's automobile plants, he observed assembly lines churning out vehicles with a mechanical efficiency unmatched in Japan. California's Central Valley revealed vast agricultural abundance, producing food surpluses that fed millions. While Japanese agriculture struggled to feed its own population, Yamamoto understood something his colleagues refused to acknowledge. America possessed an industrial capacity that was beyond the comprehension of Japanese war planners. The war calculus celebrated by his compatriots would soon prove disastrous for Japan. None could fathom the rapid and complete transformation of American industry, which within 6 months would exceed all expectations of enemy capabilities set by Japanese strategists. The notion of America as a sleeping giant, which later became associated with this pivotal moment, was largely fictional, though the sentiment behind it was genuine. Once stirred from its slumber by an act of aggression, the nation would prove invincible. The unraveling of Japanese strategic assumptions began not with a military setback, but with a single presidential speech delivered on January 6, 1942, just 1 month after the attack on Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress to outline his State of the Union address, setting ambitious production targets that Japanese intelligence officers initially dismissed as propaganda and unattainable goals meant purely for boosting American morale. Roosevelt's announced figures included 60,000 aircraft in 1942, increasing to 120,000 by 1943, 45,000 tanks in 1942, rising to 75,000 more the following year, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns in 1942 and an additional 35,000 in 1943, and a staggering 6 million tons of merchant shipping for 1942, followed by another 10 million tons in 1943. These were not standalone annual objectives, but rather part of a 2-year production plan. Even when correctly interpreted, these targets seemed fantastical. For context, Japan had produced roughly 1,000 aircraft in 1941. In comparison, the United States built approximately 19,000 military aircraft that same year, nearly 4 times the Japanese output even before full mobilization began. The gap was already significant, but Roosevelt's demand for production increases was unprecedented. To illustrate the scale of these goals, Roosevelt called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942, which was 12 times what Japan had produced in 1941 and more than 3 times America's own output. The entire Japanese aircraft industry running at full capacity with multiple shifts could not match production capabilities of a single American state. Admiral Yamamoto had warned about this potential scenario months before Pearl Harbor. In a secret conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono, whose exact timing remains disputed by historians ranging from early 1940 to November 1941, Yamamoto's warning was well documented. If ordered to fight, he assuredly predicted a tough first 6 months, but expressed absolute confidence that the war would be lost if it continued for 2 or 3 years. Despite these warnings, Japanese military planners disregarded Admiral Yamamoto's concerns. The Army's high command dismissed his concerns as cowardice, viewing it as defeatist thinking unfit for warriors. They argued that American society was too complacent, fragmented, and corrupt to mobilize effectively for total war. They cited factors such as isolationism, labor conflicts, racial strife, and political divisions as proof of America's lack of unity and discipline required for modern warfare. However, they were profoundly mistaken. Just weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American industrial sector underwent a transformation that rewrote the rules of contemporary warfare and set new benchmarks for national mobilization. The War Production Board was established on January 16, 1942, precisely 40 days following the assault. Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive with no military background, chaired this newly created board and wielded authority unparalleled in peacetime American history. His mandate included commandeering factories, redirecting raw materials, setting production targets, and swiftly converting entire industries. The War Powers Act granted him nearly absolute control over industrial output. The speed of the transformation astonished even those familiar with America's manufacturing capabilities. General Motors, the world's largest automobile manufacturer and a symbol of American industrial might, halted civilian car production on February 10, 1942, just 64 days after Pearl Harbor. The last vehicle to roll off the assembly line was a Chevrolet sedan at noon. By midnight, that same line had been retooled for tank manufacturing. By March 1st, Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, originally designed to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, commenced production operations. This massive facility featured its own railway system, power plant, and fire department. At peak capacity, Willow Run manufactured one complete bomber every 63 minutes. Every major American automobile manufacturer, Ford, Chrysler, Studebaker, Packard, halted civilian vehicle production entirely during the war. These companies had produced 4.5 million cars in 1941, representing America's demand for personal transportation and embodying its way of life. However, from that point forward, they would manufacture zero civilian vehicles until the end of hostilities. Instead, these factories focused on producing tanks, aircraft engines, artillery shells, machine guns, and military vehicles in quantities that Japanese strategists believed were impossible given America's pre-war industrial capacity. The conversion of the automobile industry exemplifies American industrial adaptability during World War II. A car engine manufacturing plant could relatively easily adapt its equipment to produce aircraft engines with minimal adjustments. Workers proficient in assembling transmissions would swiftly learn how to assemble tank drivetrains as well. The core industrial infrastructure, including machine tools, trained workforce, management systems, and supply chains, could be redirected towards military production at an astonishing pace. In contrast, Japan lacked this adaptability. Its military production facilities were dedicated solely to specific types of equipment that could not easily switch or expand their operations. If a Japanese aircraft factory was damaged by bombing, it took considerable time to repair or replace it. Meanwhile, American factories, when operating at full capacity, could rapidly construct new ones within months. The sheer scale and speed of American production quickly overwhelmed Japanese expectations. In 1942, American factories churned out 47,000 military aircraft, falling short of Roosevelt's goal of 60,000 but still nearly 10 times the annual output of Japan's roughly 5,000 planes. By 1943, production escalated to 85,000 aircraft, failing to meet Roosevelt's target of 125,000 but still surpassing the total number of aircraft in existence a decade earlier. These included not only fighters and bombers but also transport planes, reconnaissance aircraft, training planes, gliders, and specialized types that Japan barely produced. By 1944, American production peaked at 96,000 units. When World War II ended in 1945, cumulative American military aircraft production stood at an astounding 297,000 units. In contrast, over the 4-year period from 1941 to 1945, Japan's total output was just 85,611 aircraft. Throughout this period, the United States maintained a more than 3-to-1 production advantage. This disparity extended beyond mere quantity. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. The US strategy involved producing vast quantities of aircraft, accepting losses due to accidents or combat, but relying on rapid replacement capabilities. Japan's approach was one of scarcity and meticulous resource management, unable to replenish its losses and watching its numerical strength dwindle over time, even amid tactical victories. The change extended far beyond mere figures on production sheets. It symbolized a profound restructuring of American society that Japanese observers struggled to understand. A case in point is the Boeing plant in Seattle. Prior to Pearl Harbor in 1941, this facility employed approximately 4,000 workers producing aircraft at a relatively slow pace. By the war's peak, the workforce had swollen to 30,000 employees working around the clock in 3 shifts every day of the week. This growth was sevenfold within less than 3 years. Similar expansions were seen across all major defense contractors throughout America. Where did these new workers come from? They came from all walks of American life. Before World War II, women made up less than 1% of aircraft industry workers. However, by mid-1942, their share had risen to over 10%. By March 1943, women comprised nearly 32% of aviation manufacturing employees, and by 1945, this proportion reached as high as 65% in some facilities. The image of Rosie the Riveter was not just a propaganda tool, it reflected millions of real women who left their homes to join the workforce supporting the war effort. These women were not simply filling clerical roles or doing light assembly work. They were front-line workers performing tasks that had traditionally been reserved for men. They welded aircraft fuselages, riveted wing sections, assembled intricate engines, operated heavy machinery, read blueprints, and conducted quality control inspections. They worked swing and graveyard shifts while also managing households and raising children. Without their contributions, achieving the ambitious production goals set by American defense industries would have been unattainable. During peacetime, African Americans were systematically barred from skilled industrial jobs through both overt discrimination and subtle barriers. However, with the onset of World War II, they found new opportunities in defense plants. Executive Order 8802, signed by President Roosevelt in June 1941, banned racial discrimination within defense industries. Although practical discrimination persisted, wartime labor shortages compelled American industry to hire workers from previously marginalized groups. By 1945, over 1 million African Americans were employed in these sectors, acquiring skills, earning wages, and fostering expectations of equality that would later drive the civil rights movement. Many teenagers left high school to join factory work under programs that allowed them to study part-time while working half-days. The elderly also rejoined the workforce, contributing their experience and discipline to factories desperate for skilled labor. Disabled individuals secured employment in roles tailored to their abilities. This massive mobilization tapped into every available worker across American society. By 1944, over 18 million Americans were employed in defense-related industries, accounting for nearly 1/7 of the national population. The Liberty Ship program epitomized America's industrial prowess and innovative manufacturing techniques. These cargo vessels, designed to be rapidly assembled using semi-skilled labor with standardized components, rolled off production lines at unprecedented rates. The most notable example was the SS Robert E. Lee, constructed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes by Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California. This record-setting achievement involved experienced workers, ample materials, and special preparations to serve as a motivational demonstration. Normal construction times averaged between 42 and 50 days per vessel, which was still significantly faster than historical standards. Even at this accelerated pace, ships that once took months to build could now be launched within weeks. During the peak of production in 1943, American shipyards launched an average of 3 Liberty ships daily, 18 merchant vessels weekly, and 75 monthly. By war's end, America had produced a total of 2710 Liberty ships, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. together surpassing the combined shipping capacity of Japan at the beginning of World War II. Japan's merchant shipbuilding efforts, operating at full wartime capacity, yielded roughly 15 vessels per month during its peak period. This stark contrast held significant strategic importance. Reflect on the implications of this shipping disparity. America was able to sustain military operations across two oceans, simultaneously supporting forces in Europe and the Pacific, maintaining economic stability at home, and providing substantial aid to allies such as Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. In contrast, Japan struggled to supply its frontline troops and suffered massive losses in its merchant fleet due to relentless attacks by American submarines. By 1945, Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to around 10% of its pre-war capacity, severely curtailing access to raw materials and military supplies for both industry and armed forces. Any analyst examining production figures objectively would have realized the mathematical impossibility of a Japanese victory. However, Japanese military leaders refused to acknowledge this reality. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of the masterminds behind the Pearl Harbor attack and an exceptionally skilled aviation tactician, recorded his fears in March 1942. Just 3 months into the war, he noted that while tactical surprise had been achieved, strategic defeat was now assured. He observed that American resilience far exceeded initial expectations. They were not only surviving, but also rebuilding their capabilities, rallying behind a unified and determined effort. Genda's concerns did not go unnoticed by his superiors, leading to his gradual exclusion from strategic planning duties. The military leadership preferred officers who unwaveringly supported the notion of inevitable triumph. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked the first significant setback for Japanese expansionist ambitions, occurring just 5 months after Pearl Harbor. For the first time since the war began, a planned invasion failed to reach its objectives. The Imperial Japanese Navy had intended to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, establishing air bases within range of Australia and solidifying their defensive perimeter. However, American and Australian naval forces intercepted the invading fleet, resulting in history's first aircraft carrier battle where opposing ships never engaged each other visually. The tactical outcomes were fairly even, but strategically, the advantage lay with America. Both sides suffered significant losses. A light carrier was sunk by each side, while the Japanese fleet carrier Shukokyu sustained severe damage and the American carriers Lexington and Yorktown also took hits. However, the more critical loss for Japan was in aircraft and pilots. The Japanese lost 90 planes and 77 experienced aviators, an irreplaceable blow to their Naval Aviation Corps given the rigorous training programs that produced few graduates each year. Replacing those 77 skilled pilots would typically take over a year even under ideal conditions, assuming adequate facilities and fuel were available. But this was increasingly unlikely as Japan's resources dwindled. Such attrition rates were manageable against an equal adversary, but unsustainable against American production capabilities. While Japan struggled to produce new aircraft, train fresh pilots, and repair damaged carriers, the United States ramped up its manufacturing efforts around the clock. American factories and flight schools churned out new planes and trained pilots on a daily basis. Every week, scores of newly minted aviators joined the ranks, while production lines produced countless aircraft hourly. The sheer scale of American industrial output tipped the attrition equation decisively in favor of America for the subsequent 3 years. Then came the pivotal Battle of Midway from July 7th to 1942. A conflict that unfolded exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, as predicted by Admiral Yamamoto. Although tactical superiority was debatable, this battle exposed Japan's strategic vulnerabilities, which American industrial might would exploit relentlessly throughout the war. Admiral Yamamoto had committed 4 fleet carriers, Akagi Kakasoryu and Hiyu, to Midway operations. These vessels embodied the heart of Japanese naval air power. They were the same carrier force that launched the Pearl Harbor attack. Their pilots, veterans of campaigns in China, Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean, had honed their skills over years of training together to achieve levels of coordination and proficiency unmatched by American aviators who often had only a few months' experience under their belts. Japanese naval aviation outmatched its American counterpart in terms of both aircraft quality and pilot skill during mid-1942. However, this advantage proved irrelevant when American dive bombers arrived at a crucial juncture over the Japanese carriers. American codebreakers stationed in a basement facility at Pearl Harbor had deciphered Japanese naval communications, supplying Admiral Chester Nimitz with precise details about enemy plans. As a result, Nimitz strategically positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown, in ambush positions northeast of Midway Island. Expecting to catch their adversaries off guard, the Japanese instead found themselves ensnared in a trap. The outcome of the battle was determined within 5 minutes on June 4th, when American dive bombers serendipitously arrived over 3 Japanese carriers that were preparing for an attack and had their decks filled with armed and fueled aircraft. Akagi Kaga and Soryu were hit by numerous bombs and rapidly turned into blazing infernos. Fuel lines ruptured, bomb magazines exploded, and armed planes on deck detonated. These once potent naval assets of Japan became flaming wrecks that eventually needed to be sunk. Hiryu, operating separately, launched a counterattack that severely damaged the American carrier Yorktown, but was itself discovered and destroyed later in the day. In a single day of intense combat, Japan suffered significant losses. 4 fleet carriers and between 248 and 320 aircraft were lost. Approximately 110 pilots perished, representing nearly a quarter of the total aircrew on board the 4 carriers. These experienced aviators could not be easily replaced. American forces also sustained substantial casualties. The carrier Yorktown was sunk by a Japanese submarine days after the battle, along with the destroyer Hammond, which had been assisting in damage control operations alongside Yorktown. A total of 307 American service members lost their lives. The critical factor was the strategic arithmetic. While America suffered the loss of 1 carrier, Japan lost 4. American industry could replace carriers more swiftly than Japan could train pilots to fly them, and Japan found itself unable to replenish either carriers or trained aviators at a rate sufficient for prolonged attrition warfare. This situation had dire consequences for Japanese strategy, becoming increasingly evident with each passing month. From June 1942 through June 1945, over the 3 years following the Battle of Midway, Japan managed to complete 6 new carriers. In contrast, America constructed 17 Essex-class carriers during this period, each one larger, faster, and more advanced than its Japanese counterparts. The Essex-class ships displaced 33,000 tons, could carry between 90 and 100 aircraft, and featured innovative damage control measures that made them exceptionally resilient to sinking. These vessels were pinnacle achievements in naval engineering and production capability. However, carrier construction was merely one aspect of the broader industrial disparity revealed by Midway. American shipyards, aircraft manufacturing plants, pilot training programs, and all other elements related to naval aviation were expanding exponentially, while Japanese capacity remained largely unchanged or even diminished as resources became scarce and factories sustained damage from bombing raids. The mathematical certainty of Japan's defeat became increasingly apparent with each monthly production report. Delving into the specifics of aircraft production reveals a stark disparity. In 1941, prior to Pearl Harbor, Japan produced around 5,000 aircraft, whereas America manufactured approximately 19,000, maintaining a ratio favoring America by nearly 4:1. By 1942, American production had surged to 47,000, while Japan managed about 20,000, widening the gap to more than 2:1. In 1943, America produced 85,000 aircraft compared to roughly 28,000 for Japan, a ratio of nearly 3:1. This trend continued throughout the war, with America amassing a total production of 297,000 military aircraft by its end. Japan manufactured a total of 85,611 aircraft from the start of the war in 1937 through its conclusion in 1945, including production prior to Pearl Harbor. Throughout years of maximum mobilization for both nations, Japan's cumulative ratio of aircraft production was more than 3:1 compared to the United States. However, this simple ratio fails to capture the full extent of the disparity because American aircraft were generally larger, more sophisticated, had greater range, and were better armed than their Japanese counterparts. For example, a single B-29 Superfortress required significantly more industrial capacity to produce than a Zero fighter, yet both are counted as one unit in production statistics. This imbalance was evident across all categories of war production, showcasing the United States' overall industrial superiority. Tanks offer an especially striking comparison. During World War II, American factories churned out 86,000 tanks, with approximately 33,000 being Sherman medium tanks, which were the primary armored vehicle used by the US in both Europe and the Pacific. In contrast, Japan produced around 6,500 tanks over the same period, most of them light models weighing less than 20 tons and ill-suited for combat against the heavy American vehicles that weighed up to 30 tons. The Type 97 Ka, Japan's most numerous medium tank, tipped the scales at just 15 tons, armed with a 57mm gun and boasting only 25mm of armor at its thickest point. Conversely, the Sherman tank weighed 30 tons, was equipped with a powerful 75mm gun, and featured frontal armor up to 50mm thick. In direct confrontations between these tanks, the Sherman would have significant advantages in terms of firepower, protection, and maneuverability, even if Japanese tanks had been technologically on par with American models, which they were not. The numerical disparity of over 13:1 rendered Japan's armored forces virtually ineffective in the Pacific theater. The sheer volume of American tanks ensured tactical superiority, even when qualitative factors favored the Japanese. Additionally, American factories produced 2 million military trucks during the war, while Japan manufactured only about 165,000. This ratio highlights fundamental differences in approaches to military logistics. U.S. forces enjoyed high mobility, with infantry divisions supported by thousands of trucks for transportation and supply operations. Meanwhile, Japanese troops heavily relied on railroads, coastal shipping, and human laborers for logistical support. When American forces disrupted Japanese supply lines, Japanese soldiers often found themselves immobile and lacking in provisions. In contrast, U.S. units maintained operational readiness due to their extensive truck fleets and well-organized supply chains even in remote areas. During World War II, American shipyards produced around 600 naval vessels, encompassing various types such as aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary ships. In contrast, Japanese shipyards completed fewer than 1,000 vessels across all categories, illustrating a stark imbalance in every area. The United States constructed 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, while Japan managed to complete only 6 after the Battle of Midway. Additionally, America manufactured over 400 destroyer escorts for convoy protection, compared to Japan's fewer than 70 escort ships. In terms of submarines, American shipyards launched approximately 200 units, whereas Japan built around 170. However, American submarines were much more effective in commerce raiding and ultimately sank a significant portion of Japanese merchant shipping. This highlights how industrial might translated into strategic advantages on the Pacific battlefield. From bases in Pearl Harbor, Australia, and later the Philippines, American submarines systematically destroyed Japanese merchant vessels. By the war's conclusion, American subs had sunk about 60% of Japan's total merchant fleet and roughly 30% of its naval forces. This maritime blockade severely hindered Japan's access to essential resources like oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from the Philippines, and food supplies across its empire. As a result, Japan's war economy faltered not due to lack of resolve, but because crucial raw materials could no longer be transported safely. At the start of the conflict, Japan had approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping capacity. By August 1945, less than % of this fleet was operational. The inability to replace these losses stemmed from shipyards operating at reduced capacity due to material shortages and damage inflicted by Allied bombings. In contrast, America's ability to construct merchant ships far outpaced the rate at which Japanese submarines could sink them. Moreover, Japan's submarine force focused primarily on warships rather than merchant vessels, making it an ineffective strategic weapon overall. While sheer figures provided only a partial understanding of the industrial divide between the belligerents, American manufacturing prowess extended beyond mere quantity. It was qualitatively superior in terms of integration, technological advancement, and operational efficiency, elements that Japan could not replicate due to its resource limitations and technological shortcomings. The B-29 Superfortress stands out as a prime example of this disparity. This aircraft was conceived with the strategic objective of attacking Japanese home islands from remote locations, addressing the challenge posed by carrier range constraints and the absence of suitable island bases at the time. Boeing's design allowed for heavy bomb loads over distances exceeding 3,000 miles while operating at altitudes above 30,000 feet, out of reach for most Japanese fighter aircraft. The B-29 was the most intricate bomber of World War II and arguably the most technologically advanced production aircraft ever constructed by any nation during the conflict. Each aircraft comprised more than 540 distinct parts ranging from large engine components to small electrical switches. Its construction required 12 tons of aluminum, along with significant amounts of copper, steel, rubber, and rare materials like magnesium that Japan struggled to procure in sufficient quantities. 4 Wright R-350 engines, each delivering 200 horsepower, propelled the bomber at speeds up to 350 MF at 30,000 feet altitude. The pressurized cabin enabled crew members to wear standard attire instead of cumbersome heated flight suits. Remote-controlled gun turrets, guided by sophisticated analog computers, provided defensive armament. The B-29 could carry a payload of up to 20,000 pounds, equivalent to the total bomb load of 20 fighter planes, over distances of 3,000 miles. It targeted previously invulnerable areas within Japan, bringing warfare directly to its cities and industries. Between 1943 and 1945, America produced approximately 4,000 B-29s while simultaneously manufacturing thousands of fighters, medium bombers, transports, and other aircraft types, illustrating the scale of American industrial mobilization. The strategic bombing campaign launched against Japan highlighted both the immense production capacity of American industry and the hopelessness of Japanese resistance once full mobilization was achieved. This offensive intensified in November 1944 when B-29s based on the Mariana Islands began conducting regular strikes against Japanese industrial targets, initially employing high-altitude precision bombing aimed at specific factories. The outcomes were unsatisfactory due to poor weather conditions, navigation challenges, and Japan's widely scattered industrial facilities. In March 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay altered his strategy by initiating nighttime low-altitude incendiary bombing raids on Japanese cities. The impact was catastrophic. On the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, Tokyo was firebombed using 34 B-29 bombers carrying a total of 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs aimed at igniting uncontrollable blazes in densely inhabited wooden structures. The inferno obliterated 16 square miles of Tokyo and resulted in the deaths of roughly 100,000 people within just one night, surpassing the casualty figures from both Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings. Temperatures reached over 1,000 Fahrenheit, causing water to boil in canals and glass to melt. Individuals who attempted to seek refuge in water were boiled alive, while those remaining inside buildings faced incineration. Those who fled into the streets suffocated from smoke or were consumed by flames. The destruction was extensive and horrifying, far exceeding anything accomplished through conventional bombing before that point. This massive raid, which claimed more lives than any single air attack up to its time, represented only a small portion of America's overall bombing capacity. Within weeks, similar incendiary bombings targeted Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, as well as numerous smaller cities across Japan. By the summer of 1945, most of Japan's major urban centers had been systematically devastated. American bombers began dropping leaflets warning specific cities about imminent attacks and returned days later to destroy them precisely as promised, illustrating that Japan's capacity to defend its civilians from aerial assaults was severely diminished. Japanese fighter defenses, already weakened by years of attrition warfare, were unable to prevent American bombers from operating virtually unchallenged over Japanese territory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, exactly 2 years after Midway, underscored how thoroughly American industrial production had overcome Japanese tactical prowess. This battle took place during the U.S. invasion of the Mariana Islands, a strategic objective because capturing them would put B-29 bombers within striking distance of Japan. The Japanese Navy launched Operation Ageo, deploying 9 aircraft carriers and accompanying vessels in an attempt to destroy American carrier forces and thwart the invasion of the Marianas. However, Japanese naval aviation, once the world's best in 1941, had been systematically dismantled over 2 years through attrition warfare. Veteran pilots who perished in earlier engagements were substituted by hastily trained novices with limited flying hours and no combat experience. These inexperienced aviators faced formidable opposition from expanded U.S. carrier fleets, which had grown significantly since the Battle of Midway. On June 19, 1944, during what American pilots would later dub the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese carriers launched extensive attacks against their American counterparts. Radar-guided and expertly coordinated defenses by seasoned fighter directors intercepted incoming formations, resulting in a devastating blow to Japan. In just 1 day, over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, either shot down or brought down by anti-aircraft fire, while American losses amounted to roughly 30 planes. The disparity was staggering. The exchange ratio favored America at more than 20-1. For Japan, losing nearly 600 aircraft in a single day was an unimaginable blow, especially considering that U.S. manufacturing could replenish such numbers within a week of peak production. In contrast, Japan struggled to produce this many planes due to shortages of materials and labor. Crucially, the loss of skilled pilots posed an even greater challenge. Training new carrier pilots on the scale required was beyond Japan's capacity. Operational constraints like fuel scarcity, the absence of experienced instructors, and a lack of functioning aircraft further hindered training efforts. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the effective demise of Japanese carrier aviation as a significant force. In subsequent engagements, such as the Battle off Lake Guff in October 1944, Japanese carriers primarily served as decoys with insufficient aircraft and pilots. This strategy failed to divert American forces from their objectives, leading to the near-total destruction of Japan's naval power. By the war's end, the Imperial Japanese Navy was largely a shadow of its former self, with surviving ships immobilized in ports due to fuel shortages. The pivotal role of women in American production also merits attention, as it exemplified a societal mobilization that Japanese planners had neither anticipated nor been able to replicate. Before World War II, American society adhered to strict norms that confined women largely to domestic duties or narrow job prospects in fields such as teaching, nursing, secretarial positions, and light manufacturing. Heavy industries were strictly reserved for men. Prior to 1941, the defense sector had scarcely any female employees. The attack on Pearl Harbor marked a turning point. As millions of American males joined military service, labor shortages became acute within the defense industry. In April 1942, the War Manpower Commission was created to facilitate the recruit women into war-related work. A notable campaign featured Rosie the Riveter, a determined woman with her sleeves rolled up, emblematic of the national push to enlist women in factory roles. The initiative met with significant success. By 1943, more than 6 million women were employed in defense industries, accounting for roughly 1/3 of the total workforce. In some aircraft manufacturing plants, women constituted over 2/3 of the labor force. These women tackled every task previously restricted to men. They wielded acetylene torches to weld fuselages together, operated enormous hydraulic presses that molded aluminum sheets, and assembled intricate engines with thousands of meticulously fitted parts. They also interpreted detailed blueprints, conducted quality control checks, drove forklifts, maneuvered cranes, and manned assembly lines, producing a wide range of items from ammunition to warships. The societal impact was substantial and enduring. Women who had never worked outside their homes found themselves capable of tasks they hadn't imagined possible, earning income, gaining financial independence, acquiring new skills, and boosting their self-confidence. Following World War II, many individuals reverted to traditional domestic roles. However, their wartime experiences profoundly altered American society. Women who had worked on B-29 bombers and Liberty ships would raise daughters who sought equal rights. The extensive industrial efforts of World War II laid the groundwork for the feminist movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Unlike America, Japan did not mobilize female labor to a similar extent during the war. Japanese women contributed significantly through agricultural work, light manufacturing, and civil defense roles. However, due to cultural norms that were more rigid than those in pre-war America, Japanese industry was less adaptable when it came to employing women in heavy manufacturing. Additionally, practical constraints such as the lack of surplus labor prevented Japan from fully mobilizing its workforce. Unlike the United States, which drafted a significant number of men into military service during World War II, Japan did not have the demographic or industrial capacity to engage in total war while sustaining comparable levels of production. The Manhattan Project exemplified the pinnacle of American industrial and scientific prowess. This vast and highly secretive undertaking employed over 130,000 people, yet few Americans were aware of its existence. The project's budget of approximately $2 billion surpassed Japan's entire defense expenditure for several years during the war. Oak Ridge, Tennessee was established in 1943 as a uranium enrichment facility, consuming 1/7 of all electricity generated in the United States at its peak operation, more than New York City used. The electromagnetic separation equipment needed to isolate fissile uranium 2T35 from common uranium 2T38 was manufactured by companies that typically produced commercial electrical devices and were converted for atomic weapons production. Simultaneously, Hanford, Washington constructed nuclear reactors to produce plutonium on an unprecedented scale. These reactors required constant cooling with water drawn from the Columbia River, processed through facilities that became the largest industrial complexes in the Pacific Northwest. The entire Manhattan Project was experimental, relying on scientific principles not yet fully understood and engineering challenges never before attempted. Los Alamos, New Mexico served as the design laboratory where scientists and engineers developed the actual atomic bombs. Robert Oppenheimer led a team of exceptionally talented scientists, many of whom were refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe, in their urgent efforts to develop atomic weapons before Germany could do so. It wasn't until after World War II that it became apparent Germany had never come close to building an atomic bomb. German atomic research was halted early in 1942 when scientists concluded that weapon development would require resources that the country couldn't divert from conventional arms production. The scientific knowledge, engineering skills, and industrial infrastructure necessary for the Manhattan Project were unparalleled elsewhere in the world. While Britain had top-notch scientists, it lacked the needed industrial resources. The Soviet Union possessed brilliant theorists but was deficient in technology. Germany initially led but eventually abandoned its efforts due to resource constraints. Japan boasted some of the best physicists globally but fell short because it lacked uranium supplies, industrial capacity, and organizational capabilities necessary for such an extensive program. Only America had all the requisite elements to scientific knowledge, industrial might, electrical power, rare materials, engineering expertise, financial resources, and most importantly, the ability to coordinate efforts across multiple sites involving hundreds of companies and over 130,000 workers. On August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets piloted the B-29 Enola Gay and dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Known as Little Boy, this weapon used uranium-235 and unleashed a blast equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion killed approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly and devastated 4 square miles of the city. Thousands more perished in the weeks and months that followed due to radiation sickness and burns. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. This weapon, called Fat Man, utilized plutonium and had an explosive force of roughly 21,000 tons of TNT. The explosion resulted in approximately 40,000 to 60,000 immediate fatalities in the partially shielded city. These attacks unequivocally demonstrated Japan's inability to defend its population from American assaults. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made his first public statement in Japanese history announcing Japan's surrender, citing the atomic bombs as a primary reason for capitulation. He stated the enemy had employed an extremely destructive new weapon with incalculable damage potential. The formal surrender took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, officially ending the Pacific War. Strategic analysis reveals that far from being Japan's greatest victory, the attack on Pearl Harbor was actually a catalyst for its eventual defeat. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto foresaw this outcome with remarkable precision. His prediction of 6 months of success, followed by increasing challenges, came true almost to the letter. The Battle of Midway took place exactly 6 months after the initial strike, from June 4th to 7th, aligning perfectly with Yamamoto's timeline. Following that event, American industrial might ensure Japan's eventual defeat was inevitable, regardless of the bravery, skill, or sacrifices made by Japanese forces. Several critical errors in strategic planning led to this predicament for Japanese military leaders. Firstly, they grossly underestimated America's production capabilities, often underestimating it by a factor of 10 or more. While they recognized that the United States produced more than Japan, they failed to grasp the extent to which American industry could be mobilized during wartime conditions. Secondly, they erroneously believed that American society was too fragmented and decadent to support total war efforts effectively. They thought Americans were soft and unwilling to endure the necessary hardships for victory. However, Pearl Harbor had a unifying effect on public opinion in America, rallying citizens behind an unwavering commitment to fight until Japan surrendered unconditionally. Thirdly, Japanese planners assumed that superior military training, fighting spirit, and tactical proficiency could compensate for material inferiority. They believed their forces could overcome numerical disadvantages through sheer excellence in combat. However, this notion did not take into account the impact of attrition warfare on troop numbers and equipment over time. In large-scale industrial conflicts involving millions of soldiers and vast fleets of aircraft, the advantage often lies with the side that can sustain higher losses and continually replenish its forces. Finally, Japanese strategists wagered that early defeats would compel the United States to negotiate for peace rather than pursue an unconditional surrender. They anticipated that casualties at Pearl Harbor in the Philippines and during other early battles would generate enough public pressure to force America into concessions, leaving Japan with significant territorial control. However, this misjudgment failed to recognize the profound impact of Pearl Harbor on American political resolve and determination. These strategic blunders compounded each other, leading to a catastrophic series of events that ultimately sealed Japan's fate in World War II. America pursued a war strategy aimed at securing an unconditional surrender, willing to endure whatever military sacrifices were required for total victory. However, their assessments were often misguided, and each erroneous assumption was exacerbated by Japan's inflexibility in the face of contradictory realities. Japanese military leaders, steeped in a culture that prioritized spiritual resolve over material factors, failed to recognize that industrial capacity was more crucial than sheer willpower. They persisted with aggressive campaigns despite unsustainable losses, clinging to the belief that indomitable spirit would triumph over practical limitations. American production figures illustrate the systematic mobilization of industry that ultimately defeated Japan, encompassing 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks, and around 600-800 naval vessels. This massive output was achieved concurrently with fighting Germany and Italy in Europe and North Africa, while also sustaining a civilian standard of living well above basic needs and expanding the overall economy. From 1941 to 1945, American gross national product grew by approximately 70%, producing an abundance of military supplies not only for U.S. forces but also for significant Allied contingents including Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and Free French troops. In contrast, Japan's resource allocation was entirely focused on military production at the expense of civilian welfare, yet it could scarcely match American output even under such extreme conditions. By 1944, Japanese civilians were surviving on subsistence rations as cities emptied to reduce food demands. Industrial capacity waned due to dwindling raw materials and intensifying submarine blockades from the U.S. Meanwhile, American citizens experienced relative prosperity with ample food supplies despite rationing, continued access to consumer goods albeit in limited quantities, and an expanding industrial base. The human toll of the war was immense, demanding acknowledgement alongside discussions of industrial might. Japan suffered around 2.1 to 2.5 million military deaths and 550,000 to 800,000 civilian fatalities, with uncertainty in casualty counts due to incomplete records and ongoing debates about atomic bombing and firebombing losses. American casualties in the Pacific theater amounted to approximately 100,000 killed and 300,000 wounded, significant numbers but proportionally much lower than Japanese losses. This disparity underscores the fundamental nature of the conflict: America's capacity to absorb and replace losses through an endless supply of fresh troops, new equipment, and high morale. Japan was unable to sustain its losses effectively. Each vessel sunk, aircraft shot down, or soldier killed meant an irreparable depletion of resources for Japan, while America experienced only temporary setbacks. By 1945, Japanese forces were deploying inexperienced pilots with limited training and operating damaged planes patched together from whatever spare parts were available, resorting to pine tree oil as a substitute fuel due to the scarcity of petroleum. In contrast, American forces boasted better trained pilots flying advanced aircraft from secure bases that enjoyed abundant supplies. Interviews conducted after the war with Japanese military leaders revealed the profound impact of America's production capabilities on their psyche. General Kawab Toriro, who served in various capacities within the Imperial General Staff throughout the conflict, admitted during post-war interrogations that Japan's planners had grossly underestimated American industrial might. He conceded that to match American output, Japan would need to boost its industrial capacity by a factor of 20, a goal beyond the country's resource constraints, technological limitations, labor force capabilities, and geographic restrictions. In hindsight, decades later, he acknowledged that the strategic imperative should have been clear before any military engagement began. Defeating America through armed conflict was mathematically unfeasible due to its overwhelming industrial power. Admiral Yamamoto had recognized this reality long before the war commenced. From 1925 to 1927, he lived in America and studied at Harvard University while also serving as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. His first-hand experience underscored that once American industry was mobilized, it would be insurmountable. Yamamoto's 6-month prediction did not stem from tactical or strategic analysis, but rather from industrial calculations based on cold, hard facts. He believed Japanese forces could secure short-term victories for about half a year, the period required for American industry to fully gear up and for the American military to learn from initial setbacks and return with overwhelming strength. After this time frame, America's superior production capabilities would render any further resistance futile regardless of Japan's bravery or tactical proficiency. Yamamoto's prediction held true to the month, but his untimely death in April 1943 meant he missed seeing the complete validation of his warnings and the catastrophic consequences of ignoring them. The impact of American manufacturing during World War II extended beyond military triumphs over Japan and Germany. Facilities that produced B-29 bombers later shifted to building commercial airliners, cementing America's dominance in aerospace, a position it continues to hold today. Shipyards responsible for launching Liberty ships transitioned to constructing container vessels and tankers that fueled global trade. The transition from wartime industrial production to peacetime economic prosperity helped solidify America's status as the world's leading economic power for decades. This dominance began with ambitious production goals set just 30 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, which were eventually validated through achievements that exceeded even Japan's direst predictions. The contributions of workers, engineers, and managers who facilitated this industrial mobilization should be acknowledged alongside those of combat soldiers. Their efforts showcased the necessity of total societal involvement in modern warfare. The victory was achieved through a coordinated effort involving millions across entire nations, underscoring the critical role of industrial production alongside battlefield successes. Women welding Liberty ship hulls in Richmond shipyards contributed as much to the war effort as Marines landing on beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Similarly, engineers developing rapid aircraft assembly systems were just as crucial as fighter pilots securing air superiority over Japanese cities. American society mobilized for production on an unprecedented scale, proving that democratic societies could match authoritarian regimes in industrial output despite limitations on government power and the preservation of individual freedoms. Something Japanese planners believed was impossible. The aftermath of Pearl Harbor is fundamentally a tale of industrial production, resource allocation, and the triumph of systematic industrial capacity over tactical military prowess. Japanese forces were exceptionally well trained, tactically adept, courageous beyond measure, and willing to make immense sacrifices for victory. Their pilots, sailors, and soldiers fought with skill and determination that earned them respect from their adversaries. Yet these qualities alone proved insufficient against an opponent capable of producing weapons faster than they could be destroyed, ships faster than they could be sunk, and aircraft faster than they could be shot down. Modern warfare, as exemplified by American production capabilities during the Pacific War, is decided not just on battlefields but also in factories. The nation that can effectively mobilize industry, organize production efficiently, and sustain output indefinitely will ultimately triumph over adversaries, regardless of tactical victories or individual heroism displayed in combat. This lesson, learned conclusively from the Pacific War, would shape military strategies for generations and drive competition between America and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Today, historians view Pearl Harbor as one of history's greatest strategic blunders. Japan underestimated their opponent's industrial capacity, which was more than 10 times greater. Believing that superior military skill, fighting spirit, and tactical surprise could overcome material inferiority, they gambled that America would negotiate peace after initial setbacks, rather than mobilize fully and fight to unconditional surrender. This miscalculation led to complete defeat, occupation, atomic bombing, loss of empire, and a fundamental transformation of Japanese society and governance. The period between Pearl Harbor and Midway highlighted the rapid and thorough mobilization efforts undertaken by the United States. The subsequent 3.5 years of conflict showcased the certainty of American triumph once these initiatives reached their peak potential and production levels surpassed those Japan could either match or resist effectively. Franklin D. Roosevelt's ambitious production goals, announced just 1 month after Pearl Harbor in his State of the Union address, and initially dismissed by Japanese intelligence as mere propaganda to boost morale, were largely met or exceeded within the 2-year timeframe he had outlined. For instance, despite falling short of its 60,000 aircraft target for 1942 with only 47,000 produced, a still formidable output nearly 10 times greater than Japan's annual production, the goal for 1943 was to build 125,000 planes, and while the final number of 85,000 fell short, It significantly outstripped Japanese manufacturing capabilities. Similarly, tank production goals were achieved or surpassed throughout this period. The target set for 1902 and 1943 was a total of 120 tanks of 45,000 in the first year plus 75,000 in the second, which ultimately resulted in American factories producing about 86,000 tanks throughout the war. Shipping targets were also vastly exceeded, with American shipyards launching far more tonnage than Roosevelt had originally requested. Anti-aircraft gun production likewise met or surpassed expectations. This narrative underscores the critical nature of understanding an adversary's true capabilities and the dangers of basing strategic decisions on assumptions rather than factual evidence. Japanese military planners relied heavily on incomplete data, cultural biases that turned out to be incorrect, and systematic underestimation of American determination. They clung to preconceived notions of American weakness and Japanese superiority, despite warnings from Admiral Yamamoto, who had first-hand knowledge of American industrial might after living in the United States. His cautionary words were ignored as defeatist rhetoric and a lack of fighting spirit. The consequences of these miscalculations were dire. Japan suffered catastrophic defeats, experienced its first occupation by foreign forces, endured atomic bombings, lost its empire, and underwent a complete transformation of its government and society. The extent of American achievement becomes evident when one examines the comprehensive production statistics across all categories. During the war, America produced 2 to 97,000 aircraft while fighting on multiple fronts, whereas Japan managed to build only 85, 60-11 in a more concentrated effort. In terms of tanks, the United States manufactured 86,000 compared to Japan's roughly 6,500. Additionally, American shipyards launched approximately 6,800 naval vessels, while Japanese efforts resulted in fewer than 1,000 completed ships. Across every measure of military production and industrial output, the disparity was overwhelming, sustained over 4 years, and ultimately determined the outcomes of the war. The ultimate judgment on Pearl Harbor's strategic significance comes directly from Japanese sources, including the officers and leaders who planned and carried out the attack and observed its aftermath. Admiral Yamamoto, before his fatal crash on April 18, 1943, when P-38 Lightning ambushed him near Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, privately noted that while the assault was tactically successful, it amounted to a strategic disaster of unparalleled magnitude. The attack destroyed battleships, impressive targets for propaganda but increasingly obsolete in carrier warfare, and failed to damage the carriers, which would prove crucial later. The strike united American public opinion, previously divided between interventionists and isolationists, into a cohesive national consensus for total war that might not have been achievable through conventional political channels. By attacking Pearl Harbor with treachery and dishonor, Japan ensured American entry into World War II with fierce determination rather than reluctant participation. Most critically, it unleashed the full industrial capacity of the United States, mobilizing its society completely and setting in motion changes that guaranteed Japanese defeat. What was intended to cripple U.S. naval power and secure a Japanese victory instead galvanized an opponent whose industrial might, once activated, proved relentless. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor triggered the swiftest and most thorough industrial mobilization ever recorded in history. This transformation occurred because American industry's capabilities were grossly underestimated by Japanese planners who failed to grasp its potential for rapid expansion, scale, and efficiency. Workers in American factories played a decisive role in winning the Pacific War just as much as soldiers did on battlefields. Women welding bomber fuselages, men casting tank armor, engineers optimizing production lines, managers coordinating supply chains. Every individual contributing to America's wartime industrial output from December 1941 to August 1945 aided in Japan's defeat. The industrial power that astonished Japanese observers and convinced them of their impending doom was not mere propaganda or temporary success. It was a cold, calculated mobilization of resources and capabilities that Japan could never match. In just 6 transformative months from December 1941 to June 7, 1942, the strategic balance of the Pacific War shifted dramatically, illustrating that modern warfare would be won by industrial capacity as much as military prowess. The mobilization of American society during this period merits closer scrutiny. It stands as one of history's most comprehensive examples of democratic total war mobilization. Unlike authoritarian regimes that could compel sacrifices through coercion, America achieved its wartime production goals through economic incentives, patriotic appeals, and social pressure. Defense workers earned good wages, often surpassing pre-war levels. Women gained economic independence along with a sense of purpose, while African Americans found opportunities previously denied them. The War Production Board, initially led by Donald Nelson and later by Julius Krug in 1944, orchestrated this industrial mobilization with remarkable effectiveness given the immense scale and complexity involved. The board managed the allocation of limited resources, established production priorities, resolved disputes arising from competing demands, and ensured that manufacturing facilities operated at peak efficiency. This planning effort exceeded in scale what had previously been attempted only by totalitarian regimes. However, it was carried out within a democratic framework, taking into account political pressures, engaging with industry leaders, and maintaining public approval. The accomplishment is even more impressive when considering the challenges overcome. In 1941, American industry was ill prepared for war production. Factories built to produce civilian goods had to undergo extensive retooling. Workers required training for unfamiliar tasks. Supply chains needed restructuring. Management systems designed for peacetime production proved inadequate for wartime requirements. Despite these hurdles, within months American industry underwent a complete transformation, achieving production levels that were deemed unbelievable by Japanese observers. Even when presented with evidence, the rapidity of this transformation surpassed anything the Japanese planners had anticipated. In their assessments of American industrial potential, they assumed that democratic societies with competing interests and limited government power would mobilize slowly and incompletely. They expected labor disputes to disrupt manufacturing, racial tensions to hinder cooperation, and political divisions to prevent unified action. The unity and speed of America's post-Pearl Harbor mobilization shattered these assumptions completely. Reflecting on the social implications, the massive influx of women into factories challenged traditional gender roles and showcased capabilities previously underestimated or dismissed by pre-war society. African Americans gaining industrial employment and military service also confronted racial segregation and laid the groundwork for civil rights movements that would reshape American society in subsequent decades. The shared experience of war mobilization, working toward common objectives, and sacrificing for collective well-being strengthened American national identity and demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize as effectively as authoritarian regimes without compromising fundamental freedoms. The Japanese military leadership's misperception of American society contributed directly to their strategic defeat. They viewed democracy as weakness, freedom as decadence, and individualism as an obstacle to collective action. Pearl Harbor demonstrated the profound error of their assumptions. American democracy responded with a vengeance to the surprise attack, marshalling resources more thoroughly and efficiently than Japanese authoritarianism ever could. The spirit of individualism in America was harnessed for national goals, leading to remarkable achievements that surpassed Japan's conformity-driven efforts. Leveraging the diverse talents and energies of all segments of society, American productivity outstripped Japan's uniform approach. These lessons extended beyond World War II, shaping Cold War dynamics and military strategy for decades. The nation with superior industrial mobilization, production organization, and sustained output would gain a significant edge in prolonged conflicts. This realization fueled Cold War arms races, space exploration competition, and technological advancements. The pattern established during the Pacific War, where American industrial capacity proved crucial, was replicated throughout the Cold War, demonstrating that America's economic strength eventually outpaced Soviet capabilities despite some initial military advantages for the latter. The personal stories behind these statistics deserve recognition. The teenage girl from Iowa who quit high school to weld Liberty ship hulls and support her family while discovering untapped potential. The African-American man from Mississippi who moved to Detroit, found well-paying factory work, and experienced economic opportunity firsthand. The grandmother from Oregon who returned to inspect aircraft parts after retirement, ensuring quality control that safeguarded American pilots. These millions of Americans transformed the nation and shaped world history. Though they were not combat soldiers, these individuals' contributions were as critical to victory as any battlefield successes or territorial gains. Their efforts underscored the necessity of total societal mobilization in modern warfare, emphasizing the importance of civilian involvement alongside military operations. The legacy of this achievement endures. The industrial foundation built by their efforts sustained American prosperity for generations. Social changes initiated during this period fundamentally redefined roles for women and advanced racial equality, demonstrating that democracies can effectively mobilize resources, provided ideological support for Cold War competition, and continues to influence discussions on governance and societal organization. Japan learned these lessons through its devastating defeat, subsequent occupation, and the fundamental transformation of its society and government. The post-war Japan that emerged became one of the world's leading democratic nations and industrial powerhouses, thriving through peaceful competition rather than military conquest. This transformation was partly due to the realization by surviving Japanese leaders of what had led to their defeat. They had witnessed firsthand the immense industrial might of America. They came to understand that economic success stemmed from productive capacity rather than territorial conquest, from collaboration rather than caution, and from liberty rather than authoritarianism. The world observed as American industry revolutionized warfare, setting new patterns and principles that would influence military competition for decades and define the nature of great power conflicts in the industrial era. The 6 months between Pearl Harbor and Midway demonstrated that surprise attacks and tactical genius were insufficient against an opponent with overwhelming industrial superiority. Subsequent years of war showed that once mobilized, American industry could sustain simultaneous military operations across multiple theaters while maintaining civilian prosperity, an achievement unmatched by any other nation during World War II. The full measure of America's success is evident in comparative statistics from all combatants, despite comprising just 60% of the global population. The United States produced roughly 40% of all military equipment manufactured worldwide during World War II. This ratio of production to population, sustained over 4 years of maximum effort, was unprecedented and demonstrated conclusively that democratic capitalism could mobilize resources as effectively as any authoritarian system while preserving political freedom and enhancing civilian well-being. The industrial mobilization that ultimately defeated Japan continues to teach important lessons about national power, societal resilience, and the sources of strength in modern international competition. Physical bravery is significant, tactical prowess is crucial, and strategic acumen is vital. However, in prolonged conflicts between industrial powers, production capacity reigns supreme. The nation capable of producing more, faster, and better will eventually overwhelm its adversaries regardless of temporary setbacks or individual acts of heroism on the battlefield. Admiral Yamamoto recognized this truth and attempted to warn his country about it, but his warnings were disregarded with disastrous consequences. The attack on Pearl Harbor was intended to cripple American naval power and pave the way for Japanese victory. Instead, it awakened American industrial might, ensuring Japan's ultimate defeat. During the 6 months from December 1941 to June 7, 1942, American production rapidly accelerated from peacetime to wartime levels with unprecedented speed. By January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, American factories were already transitioning to war production. By February, car manufacturing came to a complete halt. In March, the output of airplanes started to increase significantly. By April, shipyards were launching vessels at an unprecedented pace. The Battle of Coral Sea in May revealed that American naval strength was recovering swiftly. In June, during the Midway battle, American forces dealt Japan a devastating blow from which it never recovered. Every month brought fresh proof of America's effective mobilization of its industrial capacity. Month after month, production figures surpassed previous records. Each passing month confirmed that Roosevelt's ambitious targets were becoming reality. Japanese intelligence officers, monitoring American output through various channels, found it hard to believe their reports. The numbers seemed incredible but were verified and undeniable. Over the next 3 years, this prodigious level of production was maintained and expanded until victory was secured unequivocally and permanently. American forces advanced across the Pacific by island hopping, backed by overwhelming material superiority. American submarines crippled Japanese commerce, replacing losses faster than Japan could sustain them. American aircraft dominated the skies, shooting down enemy planes at a ratio that reflected both superior training and vastly greater numbers. By 1945, Japan's situation was objectively dire. Cities were being incinerated by strategic bombing. The merchant fleet had been obliterated. Industrial output had collapsed. Food shortages were nearing famine levels. The military faced challenges with outdated weaponry, insufficient resources, and diminishing troop numbers. Nevertheless, Japanese officials continued to refuse surrender until the atomic bombings proved that America had weapons without any viable defense mechanisms, indicating that continuing the war would result in national obliteration. The disparity between Japan's ambitions in December 1941 and its reality in August 1945 could scarcely be more pronounced. At the start of the conflict, Japan anticipated rapid victories, territorial expansion, and a negotiated settlement preserving its imperial status and strength. By the end, however, it found itself with devastated cities, lost territories, a defeated military and foreign occupation, a situation unprecedented in its history. This dramatic shift from an aggressive power to a defeated nation took place within less than 4 years, largely due to America's unmatched industrial output that exceeded Japanese worst-case scenarios and rendered resistance futile. The dramatic turnaround of Japan's fortunes, from seemingly invincible in early 1942 to complete defeat, stemmed from the American industrial mobilization initiated after Pearl Harbor, which reached unprecedented levels of production that fundamentally altered strategic thinking. Despite numerous battles, acts of heroism, technological advancements, and tactical intricacies, the Pacific War was ultimately determined by each nation's industrial capacity. America had it, Japan did not. This critical difference proved decisive, shaping American dominance in the region for decades to come and underscoring the pivotal role that manufacturing plays in modern warfare as much as combat itself.